Hello there, guys, and welcome to the engine management series, which is going to be within the Fighter Combat School because, of course, it has a lot to do with that. In this series, we are going to visit several, in detail, several parts of how an engine worked, a piston engine worked in World War II. We are also going to see the main parts of an engine and how they worked. And at the ending, in the final videos, we are going to see how pilots used their controls to extract the best they could from the engine, because it was not as easy as just setting horsepower and going around. Actually, in some planes it was. The Focke-Wulf 90 was really famous for the Commando Grad, which was mechanical computer that would run all the engine settings for the pilot. The pilot had a single lever and the engine would do everything for him, which was of course highly desirable because the pilot could just concentrate himself on the fight, on keeping situational awareness and all that stuff. But that was not the norm. Usually a pilot had several different levels and they control different things: manifold pressure, RPM, mixture. He had also in many planes he had to control manually the supercharger, and he also had to control the radiator. So what we are going to do here is go part by part. Explain at the beginning. In this video, we are going to see how an internal combustion engine works, which is basically a piston engine. Of course, we are only going to see the most meaningful internal combustion engine for airplanes in World War II. And in particular, we are going to concentrate ourselves in what's called the four-stroke gasoline engine. Now, there were several different engines, and there are very different internal combustion engines. You have diesel engines, you have gasoline two-stroke engines, you have gasoline four-stroke engines, etc. Now, diesel engines actually existed in World War II and were used in planes. Top of my head, I can think of the Junkers 86, which had diesel engines. They were very good for long range, but they were not really good for producing power. So, out of very, very, very particular instances, they weren't used commonly. So we are not going to look at that because they were not common. Also, the two-stroke cycle engines, there were actually some very good designs by the war's end, but they never saw service in World War II. I can think right now of the Rolls-Royce Crecy, which was a really, really powerful engine based on the two-stroke cycle. However, again, we are going to speak about World War II, so we are not going to enter into those engines. We are only going to explain the four-stroke piston engine, which most planes use. Now, what's a piston engine? It's basically the question we have to start from. A piston engine is an internal combustion engine, which means that whatever happens in there happens in there. I would go with a technical description, but why? There's no reason for that. It's just an engine, and what it does is to use pistons, which are moving within cylinders, to move a crankshaft and to rotate it. And the crankshaft itself is connected to a propeller, and as the crankshaft rotates, the propeller will rotate as well. And the propeller is what pushes your plane. Now, there's some more complication into this, and we are going to visit it slightly as we go by with these videos. Now, as you can see in the image, you can easily see how the pistons are connected to the crankshaft through connecting rods. Where the piston goes up and goes down, it's very easy also to see how that movement translates into rotating movement, which is basically what you want to do in a piston engine. You want to translate what the power you are producing with the pistons moving up and down and translate it to a rotating motion, which is going to later move your propeller. Also, it's going to move your supercharger, etc. But we are going to enter into that in later videos. Now, this particular engine you're looking at is a inline 4. But actually, if you think about this thing tilted with 6 cylinders per row, and a second 6-cylinder row mounted in a V, is basically a V engine, which is what most inline engines use it. Then if you turn it upside down, it would be an inverted V engine, which was very common with the Germans. The Junkers 213, the Daimler-Benz series, those had inverted V engines. Now, if instead of looking at them and looking them in a line, you put them in a circle, so instead of having those cylinders in a row, you have them like in a star shape, you will have a radial engine. That's why it's called radial, because the cylinders are mounted as radially from the center. And if you put 2 rows of those radially mounted cylinders, you will have a twin row radial engine, which is mostly what the Focus Wide used, what the P47 used, what the F4U used, what the LA5 used. Most fighter engines were twin row radial engines, for the radial engines planes, I mean. Now, how this stuff worked. Now, as you can see, there are pistons, there's a crankshaft, there are connecting rods, and the piston is going to move up and down, up and down, up and down. As it moves up and down, the rods are going to transfer that power, and the crankshaft will rotate. But why do these pistons move up and down? Well, here is where the internal combustion part comes. Now, when a piston engine is working, instead of the cylinders, as I said, they are going to be up and down cycles. Let's call it a cycle. Within a cycle, there are going to be 4 strokes, and you can see them in the picture right now. The first one is intake. The piston is moving down, air is coming inside the piston through a valve. Well, air and also fuel. Aerosol fuel. Fuel comes and is aerosolized, is mixed with air, and is put into the cylinder. The cylinder sucks that mixture through moving downwards. It creates a vacuum within the cylinder, and that brings that mixture inside. The second stroke is compression. Once the intake is complete, the piston starts moving up. And now all the valves are closed. So the mixture, which is within the cylinder, is going to be highly compressed. The next one is power. Once the top of the movement of the piston within the cylinder is reached, and the maximum compression of the mixture is reached, a spark plug will spark, and the mixture will burn and will literally explode. And that explosion will force the piston downwards. And the last stroke is exhaust. As the cylinder moves up again, the remains of the explosion, the consumed air and fuel, will be exhausted through an exit valve. And then the whole process will start again. Once the exhaust is done and the cylinder is up again, it will begin the intake again, compression, power, exhaust. Intake, compression, power, exhaust. And it's going to be working all the moments like this, at all times. Now, if we go back to the picture we saw before, which is here, you can see that each of the pistons is in a given position. When you are working with more than one cylinder, you have to balance the cylinders out, so each one of them is in a given stroke at a given moment. So the first cylinder, when it's an intake, the second one will be a compression, the third one will be a power, the fourth one will be an exhaust. So at all the moments, they are in the proper stroke where they belong to, given their position. And it's easy to see that at every given moment there will be at least one cylinder producing power. And it's also easy to see that if that power is translated into a crankshaft which is rotating, the inertia of the crankshaft rotating is going to be transferred to the other cylinders as well. So the more cylinders you have, actually the more efficient this proceeding becomes, because you are not just relying on the power you are producing within your cylinder to move the piston up and down. The crankshaft through the rod is also helping you doing that motion in the unpowered strokes, which are intake, compression, and exhaust. You only produce power within a cylinder in the power stroke. So it's like a very finely tuned instrument where everything is in perfect balance. All right? That's basically how a piston engine works. It's not more complicated than this. It's very easy to understand. You can easily see the picture and just understand how it works. Now, it's totally unrelated on how the cylinders are deployed. I mean, this is exactly the same in a radial engine that in an inline engine. All the pistons are connected one to each other, and all of them through the gangs and crankshaft, and all of them produce power that the crankshaft will transfer to the propeller, and the propeller will rotate, and your plane will fly. Easy peasy. Now, we are going to start looking at some particular problems here. Not problems, but characteristics. Now, if you look at those pistons and you see the position where the cylinder is at the bottom and the position where the cylinder is at the top, the volume within the cylinder is very different in both. I mean, when the piston is at the bottom, there's a huge volume. When the piston is fully up, there's going to be a tiny volume within. Well, the relationship between the volume of the piston fully moved down and fully moved up, and the difference between the volumes within those moments is what's called the compression ratio. Okay? Now, the compression ratio basically what means is that is how much you are compressing whatever is within the cylinder. So, in the intake, let's say in the intake you take, I don't know, 1 liter, okay, of air, which is a lot. I mean, in one piston you are not going to take a liter, but bear with me. If you have a 12:1 compression ratio, when the piston is to the top, that 1 liter is going to be 1/12 of a liter. And that mixture, which is inside and has been compressed, is now 12 times, has 12 times more pressure than in the intake stroke. So let's say that in the down position, we put 1 liter of mixture of fuel and air at 1 atmosphere. Well, at the top of the displacement of the piston, we will have 1/12 of a liter at 12 atmospheres. Alrighty? Now, this is very important because one of the biggest limits and probably the biggest problem you run in a piston engine is that to produce more power, usually you want two things. Well, actually one, but that one can be achieved through two different ways. You want to be burning as much fuel-air mixture as you can by second. The more air-fuel mixture you burn, the more power. It's pretty logical. At least it comes easy to the mind. Now, there are different ways to achieve this higher volume of air-fuel per second. The first one is to increase how much of air and fuel you put in the cylinder in a given time. But this has a hard limit, of course. I mean, the limit is at how big the cylinder is. If you make it too big, the engine is going to be huge, it's going to weigh a lot, and your plane has to be really big to carry this engine. So it's not really, there's a diminishing returns efficiency in going bigger. Now the second way is to compress it as much as you can. So put as much air fuel mixture in the cylinder as you can, and then compress it to the top of your limits. The higher the compression ratio, the higher the power you are going to produce. Now, how do we increase the compression ratio? There are several ways to do so. The most obvious one is to put the piston as down as you can in the intake stroke, and then put it as high as you can in the compression states. However, there are certain limits to this because there's so much room you can fit within a cylinder. I mean, one cylinder can't have 1 liter of capacity. Well, it can, but the engine is going to be massive. So you want to measure up how big your engine has to be. And once you are at your desired size, you really can't move further up because otherwise the engine will be too big and too heavy to produce the power you want. So the second way to increase the compression of the fuel-air mixture is to increase the manifold pressure. Actually, the manifold pressure is nothing else than the pressure at which the air-fuel mixture comes into the cylinder at the intake stage. As I said before, if in the intake we have 1 liter of air fuel at 1 atmosphere, when we compress it to the top, we will have 12 atmospheres of pressure because it increases linearly. If we put 2 atmospheres of pressure in the intake stroke and we compress it to the top in a 12 compression radio, we will have 24 atmospheres. So the easiest way is to increase the manifold pressure, to increase the pressure at which the fuel and the air come into the engine. Now, everyone will be thinking, oh cool, we have infinite power. We just put 5 atmospheres in a 50 compression radio cylinder and we will have huge power output. Now, there are some limits to this. The first limit is temperature. Now, one of the laws of the thermodynamics says that if you have a gas and what you have inside the cylinder is nothing but a gas, because it's air mixed with aerosolized fuel, when you compress a given volume of gas, temperature will increase a lot. Conversely, if you get a given volume and you expand it a lot, temperature will decrease. Now, the problem here is, of course, the temperature rising. Because if you compress the mixture a lot, what you are going to get is very, very, very hot cylinder heads. And, of course, if you get very hot cylinder heads, what you can end up is with a broken cylinder. And let's say that's not good for the engine. Now, that's the first of the limits. How do we help this? Well, the first idea is to add an intercooler. An intercooler is something that just cools down the charge before you put it into the cylinder. So if we start from a colder point, when we reach higher compression, there will be no problems with temperature. Well, that's actually a very original idea and one that worked. Actually, engines in World War II, most of them had intercoolers. And they also had different methods to cool down the charge. For instance, one of the most common was to use an stabilizer like WWII, the very well-known alcohol water mixture that the Germans had. Well, also the Allies had. I mean, ADI is nothing but alcohol and water, which is put into the mixture to cool it down and to stabilize it. So we can somehow help with the temperatures, but of course there's a point to that, because if you want a 50 compression radio cylinder, there's no, I mean, no matter how much you cool the charge before you put it into the cylinder, it's going to be super hot when you are at the top. So you have a limit on temperature. You can toy a little bit with that, cooling down the charge, but you have a limit there. The second limit is knocking. And knocking is phenomena, let's call it that way, that happens when a very, very compressed mixture of fuel and air is ignited. Okay? What happens is that at a given threshold, there's a given threshold, when you go past that, the fuel and air will stop burning as a whole. I mean, combustion will happen randomly instead of happening as a whole in the mixture itself. So part of the mixture will burn, part of the mixture will not. Now, that's bad. That's really bad. First of all, because you are losing power. I mean, not all your mixture is burning. So the power you're producing is not as high as it should be. Now the second problem is quite more problematic, and is that if you are not producing the power you're supposed to while the other cylinders are, you are producing vibration because your cylinder is not moving as it should. And the third one is that unequal combustion kind of stresses out the cylinder a lot. So given enough time, it's going to break the cylinder. And last is that the exhaust phase is designed to take care of burnt out air and fuel. If you have unburnt fuel, the valve might have problems evacuating all of that out of the cylinder before you start the cycle again. So you can start the intake with still some of the unburnt air and fuel from the previous cycle, and that's going to mess up the whole thing a lot. As we saw before, every cylinder is linked with each other. It's hardwired. I mean, all of them are connected to the crankshaft. So whatever goes wrong in one cylinder is going to mess up the things in the other cylinders. So if you start having knocking in one of the cylinders, the other cylinders are going to suffer it as well. And the whole engine goes into a mess very, very, very quickly and actually can break down. I mean, the kind of vibration knocking produces is not the kind of vibration an engine can stand for a long time. More than 30 seconds, even more, in some engines, more than 20 seconds of knocking would destroy the rods or break the cylinders or crack the crankshaft. Knocking is something you don't want in an engine at all. So that's the top limit of the compression ratio you can achieve. Now, things here become a little more technical because I should start speaking a little bit about fuels, and I actually thought about making a video about exclusively fuels, but honestly, I don't think a lot of you guys want to learn about chemistry here, and organic chemistry in particular. Besides, I'm no expert in that. I know some, but don't know a lot. So let's keep it simple. You guys probably will have heard about the octane rating of fuels. Okay. Now the octane rating is nothing other than how stable a fuel is. Okay. The higher the octane rating, the more stable it is. And the more stable it is, the higher compression it allows before knocking happens. So the first thing and the first way around knocking is adding a more stable fuel. So higher octane fuels will be allowing you to increase your pressure and allow for higher compressions where the power stroke is reached. Now, of course, also there's a limit to that, because even very high stable fuels will knock sooner or later. Also, there are other ways around that, which is adding stabilizing additives to the mixture. For instance, again, ADI, methanol water, that has both a cool down and a stabilizing effect. The stabilizing effect, what basically it means is that you can achieve more compression ratio from the same fuel. That's what you would without it. So the higher the compression ratio, again, the higher the power you produce. So potentially, if you have a higher octane fuel, you will produce more power. Now this is related mostly with the fact that the high octane fuel is more stable, but also we have to say that high octane fuel also usually has more chemical energy. So when you burn it, it adds a little bit more power. So well, there's a lot of minimal things here and technical things here, but we are going to keep it simple. So higher octane, more stable. Higher compression ratios, higher chances of knocking, more temperature in the cylinder heads. And more temperature you have to deal with the cooling, whatever cooling your plane has. Might be liquid cooled, might be air cooled. In whichever case, you have to ensure that there's enough cooling so the cylinder heads don't become too hot. All right. So yeah, I think that's mostly it for this video. I think we explained pretty well what an internal combustion 4-stroke engine is, how it works, Which are the limits of how much power you can get out of one of these engines? It's mostly related with how high your compression ratio is, how good your cooling is, because the better the cooling, the less problem temperature will be at the top of the cylinder movement, and how high octane fuel can be a really good asset in ensuring that you will have more stability and you can achieve higher compression radius and head for more power. Also, we have seen that there's a given limit to all of that. I mean, there's a limit to the compression radius you can achieve because of knocking. There's a limit on how big your compression radius is going to be because of how big your cylinder can be. Because in a given engine, you want to make it just so big as to make it as usable on different planes. And also, you don't want to make it overly heavy because the heavier the engine is, the heavier the plane has to be, and the less efficient will be in power loading and power to weight ratio. So yeah, this is it for this video, guys. I hope you understood it perfectly. I hope you learned something. This is the first video. Again, in the next one we are going to see further things. I think in the next one we are going to start to see at forced induction, superchargers and turbochargers, why they started happening, how they came around, why they were so useful, and how they operated. Thank you very much for watching, and see you later.